Sure, go ahead.
That's the great thing about this discussion. It always brings up something else. In the past 10 years or so, have there been years when we did not fund equipment replacement or any of these other funds?
We did it about 3 or 4 years in a row. We started in 2009, 2010. And what that did to some of the departments is that when their vehicles got to a point, when you don't fund it for 4 or 5 years, your vehicles get there and you run out of money to replace them, and then it has to come out of their operating. They have to find it in their operating budget. So yes, we have done it to eliminate the structural deficits. But again, one-time solutions.
Right, agreed. Except for where Hammond PD is concerned, and they're driving some really old cars, which I commend you for. Keep them on the road, which means Public Works has some really good mechanics keeping those things going. My other question is on retiree medical. Does using that fund balance or part of that fund balance, does that have any impact on the trust fund that we set up for retiree medical?
It won't this year because I already put those $200,000 into the budget. So I've already set that aside or accounted for it so that we can contribute. In future years, it will really depend on what kind of premiums we get.
Right, and how much we put in. Okay.
And Chris reminded me the last piece of that, and it's a very important piece, is there are some projects that have carried over the years that are maintenance projects for facilities. And we took $505,000 worth of projects. It's a total of 4 projects that we took out of the budget to help eliminate that structural deficit. If those items were to become an urgency, we'll have to find the funding for them.
And what were those? What was that regarding the
facilities maintenance?
Okay.
So there are projects like painting our buildings that are, they have, their paint is very deteriorated and it's not very aesthetic to look at, but it's to help protect the buildings. So there's things like that. There's things like cleaning out the air ducts, and for people like me who suffer from allergies, those things are really important.
Well, we'll clean out your air duct.
Electric panel inspections was also taken out, and then the recarpet of the City Hall first floor.
Okay, and you said that was about $500,000.
Yes, $505,000.
Well, that comes up to 3.5 because math is not my strong suit, but I was adding up the numbers before that, and it was 3.1, so we were a little short. Okay. Thank you for clarifying that. In the process of doing this, and admittedly, this is relatively new for me sitting here looking at municipal budgets, but when I was a municipal employee and working on budgets, whenever we had issues to contend with, whether it was something like this, when it was looking like revenues weren't going to match up with expenditures, the process that I'm familiar with is that department heads were given a percentage, and they were directed to go back, sharpen their pencils, and see where they could trim out of their budgets with their direct input, because they know their operations better than anybody.
Right.
And so that's what I'm familiar with in approaching when the numbers don't match up. City managers that I worked for over the years always said, you go back to your departments, and that was the direction, whether it was 1%, 2%, 5%, whatever it was. And that way, in one sense, you have automatic buy-in. Nobody likes having to trim their budgets, because if you build an honest budget, it's what you think you need to get the job done and provide the level of service that your community expects. And to have to trim it is painful, but it's it's a realistic situation that you may have to face. So when you're looking at coming up with these option B fund balance proposals, was this the result of direct input from department heads or their operations perspective?
No. This is the difficulty we have here. Something between 74 and 80% of the total budget goes to police and fire. And so when you pass a Measure U and you want to make them stronger, you're not going to go back and say, give me a 10% cut out of the general fund or whatever. We need to take 2 positions out of police. And so the difficulty is coming up with $3.5 million out of 20% of the budget. And so you start cutting that 20%, which is about $6 million. Now you're having the rest of the staff. You've gone to, prior to my coming, prior to your coming, they've cut the staff. They've trimmed down from 270 odd positions to 217. They've done some contracting out. They've gotten bids, etc. They've withheld raises. They've withheld cost of living. And so, from my perspective, I would create even more of a morale problem if I went to Deanna and said, you're 20, you got to kick in $400,000 or whatever it's going to be. You might as well close down the service. So that's the real difficulty. We're so big on police and fire, and the community voted for the Measure U and stuff, that it's very difficult to go back. So we took a look at the budget itself and where we could manage the budget and still keep almost all our services intact.
Okay, thank you for that. Obviously the City Council has an obligation to balance the budget, and there's a certain level of service that our community expects. Whether we can realistically fund it is always the X factor, and we don't really know with any certainty what revenue is. You can look at historical perspectives, and that certainly gives you an idea. But we do have a responsibility to balance the budget. And I appreciate all of the work that everybody in whatever corner of the universe they were working on to try to do this. As I mentioned at our last council meeting, I'm a little conflicted, I guess, about the Measure U resolution and the intent. I heard comments from Measure U committee members, and I appreciate their perspective because they were involved deeply in doing the research, going out and drumming up the community support to get first Measure E passed, and it almost made it. And we probably would be having a totally different discussion if Measure E passed, but it didn't, so now we have Measure U. And I understand the intent that it was specifically for public safety, police and fire. And we've all signed the companion resolution that says we would abide by the intent of Measure E. So the part that's conflicting me is within that resolution, it very specifically says that wages and benefits can be used for out of Measure U funds. So I'm a little confused by, I guess, the pushback from Measure U committee members saying, no, we don't want to do that. I empathize with Carly's point. I haven't personally heard it's their officers and our officers. I haven't heard that myself, but I could certainly recognize that feeling could exist. So this is the dilemma that I have in looking at using some Measure U funds, which the resolution allows, and the comments from some of the Measure U committee members who said, that's not what we intended it for. That's not what we were promising people when we were out campaigning. Now, I don't know, I don't have any control or any ability to go back and revisit what promises may or may not have been made during the Measure U campaign. I was a staunch advocate for Measure E and Measure U and offered public comment at hearings on that as a strong advocate of it. And that was a lot of my motivation for throwing my hat in the ring to be considered to fill the vacant seat by appointment. So I fully understand the passion of not wanting to spend it on that, but I don't really see the difference. And I've talked to some of them, not every Measure U committee member, but I've talked to several of them, and they're not in disagreement with my position on that. So I guess where I'm coming to is I'm okay with option A or option B, or a hybrid of the two. I understand that you can see that there might be, it was built on $10 million a year anticipated, and we have something over that. I recognize that there's no guarantee that the next year or any subsequent year you may fall short of the 10 million. So I certainly understand and can support being conservative in approaching it. Just because you have it doesn't mean you go out and spend it. There's always going to be rainy days and always going to be things that come up that you didn't anticipate. But I do appreciate the fact that you went back and came up with an option B, because it gives us something to select from. I do appreciate the city manager's position on, because I was going to ask the same question of what does the city manager recommend, A or B, and so I appreciate him sharing that with us. So I'm starting to ramble now, so I think I'll just stop and let somebody else talk for a while.
Carly, did you want to go, or do you want me to go?
Can I just ask one question here? Did we look at any CIP projects that we could push out another year and not have the cost?
We don't have any general fund CIP projects. We haven't been able to afford a general fund CIP projects in years. So everything, all of our CIP projects are in special funds and DIFs. And,
Thank you guys for all the work that you guys all did, all your departments. I know that this has been tough, and I think that you've come up with a lot of creative ways to cut, and so that's very impressive. I kind of put together a pie chart so that maybe you guys can see. I didn't print them out, but I didn't have time. But this is our public safety department in blue, and there's 160 employees. And in green is 21% of the rest of the departments. And there's 144 employees. And so for all the cuts that you've made, this being how it's balanced, this speaks volumes to the money that we're coming up with.
That also reinforces the fact why it would be very difficult to go into the green portion and start trying to recover $3.5 million. It's just, it isn't doable in any kind of sensible way.
Well, I appreciate the creativity that you guys all have done.
Yeah. One more thing on the Measure U. They taught me a long time ago that a good city manager has to have political acuity, but not be apolitical. Can't participate in that. My opinion is that if you go with Measure A or Budget A, a lot of people are going to be showing up and saying, "See, we told you we didn't want to vote for Measure U because you're going to use it for general fund purposes." And so I didn't want to raise that at this time. There are sufficient as you can see, we can balance the budget. It is a balanced budget. It doesn't necessarily end the structural deficit and such, but it sure cuts it down a lot. And I just didn't want to rain on the parade. We've got a budget. We can work with it. Why anger a large segment, not just the Measure U committee? I think they can acquiesce to us using it to pay salaries. You can make a good cause for that. But a lot of people are going to go see, you're doing what we thought, and you're not supposed to.
Maybe we are asking the rest of our departments to fund the MOUs for the police and fire department.
Yeah. But the priority here is police and fire. When you're spending 80% of your budget, all funds, on police and fire, that's your priority.
This is my turn. So I have first a question that actually a lot of my questions have already been answered, and one of them was with the graph that Carly just made. Public safety represents 79% of the entire budget?
75.
75.
Including each Measure U.
The general fund only portion, not the Measure U, is
Okay, well,
75.
before, there's a whole lot of back and forth about the general fund and Measure U. Let's be clear, this entire budget is general fund, all of it, including Measure U. It's all general fund. So all of this money is coming out of the general fund, including Measure U, which it's got like a little bowl inside the general fund, right? So public safety makes up how many percent, what percentage of this entire general fund budget?
I don't have a calculator, so
Okay,
I
so
don't have that answer.
79.48.
Close to 80%. So we're going to take this under budget B. That $3.5 million is coming out of 20% of the entire budget, right? So it's become a burden on the general fund. Measure U has, because in a sense, the general fund, aside from Measure U, is going to continue to fund above and beyond public safety. So everybody else has to cut so public safety can move forward.
I don't think in your wildest dreams, when Measure U was pushed forward, whatever, did they ever think it would help drain the general fund. But that's what's happened, because the decision was made to pay for the salary increases, the 5-year increases.
Right.
And
that was done purposeful, because our officers were already at the bottom of the pay and benefit, both police and fire, and it would be very difficult to implement the chief's plan to get those officers hired, especially now that Measure Z, Measure DD, and Measure S passed in other cities, and they're using a big chunk of that funds for public safety as well, right? So it would have been very difficult, and had that not happened, we wouldn't have the number of officers that we currently have today. Is probably a safe assumption. We may have had some increase, but not much. From what I've heard is that there was some instability within police and fire prior to that. People were looking at maybe leaving. People definitely weren't looking at coming here. So it's put a huge burden on the rest of the 20% budget, 21% budget, portion of the budget. And I don't think that's fair to the rest of the city employees. And it's not fair, in my opinion, to the rest of the citizens that live here. Because, and I mention this because we all get people calling, complaining about something going on. There's graffiti, there's trash, there's potholes, especially after it rains, there's potholes. Well, that money's got to come from somewhere to fix it. And if we don't have the money because we're cutting it all, then there's going to be potholes still. And if there's graffiti, I look at what not the hard cost of the money coming out, but the long-term soft costs and what that impact has on us long-term from a perspective of optics. Hemet's got graffiti. Hemet's got trash. Hemet's got homeless. Hemet's not doing anything about it. Hemet's this. Hemet's doom and gloom. And listening to all of this in this budget, it's, to me, and my note is this is so depressing. Because I've yet to heard, and the Measure U committee, rightfully so, when I was listening to it yesterday, talked about what are you doing to make cuts to balance the budget? And we can't cut our way to prosperity. And what's depressing to me is what I haven't heard is what are we doing to bring new businesses here to increase revenue, as opposed to we're making cuts everywhere, but we haven't had any discussion about getting jobs here, and haven't had any discussion about getting new housing here, and we haven't had any discussion about getting new businesses here. We've got a lot of vacant buildings in this town that have been vacant for 20 years, and yet I don't see them filled. What are we doing to get businesses to come here? And if we continue to have bad press in the newspaper and bad press on social media, we're going to continue to have doom and gloom. We're going to cut. Pretty soon, Hemet's going to be public safety only. And at that point, why even have a city? And I'm not saying that's an option. Because what I'm not seeing is that there has been very little concerted effort to increase revenue instead of let's just cut. I talked about this in last year's budget meetings, is that it was sad to me that we didn't see a projected increase in DIF fees. We didn't see a projected increase in building permit fees and anything related to building and development. And I'm seeing that again. There's no increase in development. I was at a meeting this morning with city managers from Hemet, San Jacinto, Paris, Moreno Valley, and Beaumont. Moreno Valley is on fire right now. On fire, with businesses coming, jobs being created, people moving there. The 21st largest city in California, at a little over 200,000 people. And yet I look at, it's some research that I did, I looked at their budget, and on May 1st, the Board of Supervisors approved their contract with the Sheriff's Department, $43 million, and they're budgeted for 94 deputies. How many officers do we have in our department? 86? So they've got 8 more deputies than we have officers, and their budget for police is twice as big as ours. And yet there's people out there that want us to contract with the Sheriff's Department. I think that would be a bad move. I think that this budget represents, and for me, option A represents more stability for our department because it fits within the resolution. The money's allocated to public safety, and the money doesn't get cut from essential services for the other departments. Our people need training, because if they don't know, how are they going to provide good customer service? They need to be trained. So for me, budget A is representative of what the city needs and what the citizens of this town expect. What I find good is that there's a large constituents that takes pride and wants to know what's going on in our community, and it's local. What saddens me is that there's not this much interest in what happens at the state budget, and I think that's where there's a lot of heartburn with raising taxes. I don't want to raise taxes. I didn't want to raise taxes. But this is local money that's being used locally for what the people wanted it to do, and that's public safety. Clean up our streets. Make it so that we can bring businesses in. The people that I've talked to, both public safety and citizens, have said we've seen a drastic change in the amount of crime and about what's going on in our community, and that it's a clean place to be. But where's the other side of the folks trying to get those businesses in, trying to get development done, trying to get people to move here? We need more housing here. We have California's is in a housing crisis, and yet we don't have any housing being built in Hemet. That's pretty sad, because it's being built in San Jacinto. It's going gangbusters in Menifee. They're building it everywhere but here, and every time a house gets built, that's more tax revenue going to that city, more tax revenue going to that city. I would like to see us focus more on how do we raise revenue as opposed to how do we keep cutting, because pretty soon there's not going to be anything to cut. When you talk about in B, it also talks about you're going to cut the vehicle fund. So that's 1/7, right? It's spent spread over 7. So next year we're looking at 1/6 that they've got to contribute so that they stay on track. which now is going to be an increase. So we're kicking that can down the curb if we go with kicking that can down the road if we go with option B. And it's going to cost more next year. And yet, I don't see right now anything being done to raise revenue for next year. The numbers that just came out were for our sales tax were down a little less than a quarter, or a little more than 0.25% from last year, the previous year.
The ones from this quarter are down, but it's because we got a report from HDL letting us know that several large corporations, Amazon included in that, who've still filed paper returns, had not filed yet when they sent the last true-up statement.
Now, speaking of Amazon, I think the city of Seattle their city council just passed a head tax, and they've got businesses wanting to leave there. I think our doors should be wide open for them and say, come on in, we've got plenty of space to build, we got plenty of opportunity for housing. Come to Hemet. We don't have that head tax, but we sure will take your tax dollars. I think that should be a campaign. But it's this whole budget, this budget A and B, it's depressing to me that it's all about cuts. And there's no recommendations in there on how we're going to generate more revenue. And there's a lot of influential people in this community that I don't see working hard enough to bring in more business, to bring in more housing, to bring in more companies. And that's what's sad. And we're all in this together. We all live here. We all work here. I spend as much of my money as I can. I know there's some planning commissioners that would like to see a Nordstrom's come in. Maybe a Nordstrom's rack. I don't know. But we need to focus more on getting business here, getting people here, spend their money here, so that we can then fund all of this at the level that the citizens of Hemet have come to expect. Because I get phone calls all the time. Potholes here, there's trash here, graffiti there. Well, if we keep cutting, we're not going to have anybody to clean any of it up or fill potholes or anything. They're all going to leave. Okay, I think I'm off my soapbox now. Thank you.
No, but it was a good discussion, because you're certainly right with regards to revenue and that not being spoken of. And we talked about it last year, and here we are again. And we also talked about getting rid of some city properties that we don't need to have. That I don't know where we are. Well, we aren't anywhere on that. And we've got some properties that we should be continuing to look to sell, so that, you know, I mean, all it is land, so that we can increase the revenue as well, rather than have a piece of vacant land doing nothing for us. So we really need to continue to pursue keeping those, and actively keeping those on the market, and actively getting someone working on selling them. So another revenue stream, certainly a one-time only, but it certainly would help the coffers. So I totally agree with you, Michael, with regards to the revenue and what social media has done, what, you know, we always hear the complaints, but there's been a lot of good things that have happened this last year in this city. And a lot of it was due to Measure U and the police and public safety. So that being said, it'd be nice to start a campaign, a good campaign, about what it is we have here and why people should come here and why businesses should come here, and actively pursue that avenue so that we aren't doing this year after year after year. I don't know if good points, very good points.
Right. Some last minute comments, and then I am going to open it up for public comment.
Just a couple more questions. You mentioned that in option B, there's about $1 million in not filling current vacancies. Do you have a listing of what positions we're talking about?
I don't have them here. We have them in the office at City Hall. We do have them. We can provide them for you.
I guess for me to make an informed decision on this, I really kind of need to know what is it that we're leaving vacant. I have to agree that as much as I'm a advocate for public safety, and I applaud the efforts of both of our chiefs and the work that they've accomplished and the plans that they've set forth and that they're accomplishing. We're seeing the results of that. But I also know that the other city departments are struggling. And there's, by God, thanks a lot for the dedicated and committed employees that we have that are putting in countless hours above and beyond what they probably like to do, just so that they can get the job done. And that comes from their personal pride and integrity in doing a good job, and I can't thank them enough for those efforts. But for me, I think I would like to know what positions that we're looking to keep vacant, at least for a year, because I think that's going to help sway me on which option I might advocate for. And then just to echo a little bit of what I heard the mayor talking about is, although you can't really lay it out necessarily in a budget document, but I think philosophically, what I would really appreciate seeing, and I think a lot of the business community would appreciate seeing, is what is our, I know we have a strategic plan that seeks to draw people in here, not necessarily because of what we have to offer other than a gateway to a lot of activities. And that's certainly good, and it's a novel approach. But I think that we have some really good brain power in this community that have been here a long time that might be able, if nothing else, in an ad hoc committee approach to looking at economic development, what people have contacts, who can they reach out to, and that might really help supplement some of the vacancies that we have in community development that they can't really ever get their head above water because they're always having to put out fires. Not that the fire department cares about those fires, but so I think going forward, whatever budget we pass and whatever we do, I think it would really be nice to look at how we can work smarter, not necessarily harder, and avail ourselves of a rich talent pool that I think is in this valley.
Let's see if I'm stepping where I shouldn't step. It's often common for a Chamber of Commerce to have a committee that does exactly that. They go out and talk, etc. The difficulty here is we have a Chamber of Commerce with two masters. And so, and we're competing. We're competing with San Jacinto for summer types of commercial and industrial, whatever, housing and such. So that's a difficulty that I see here. And yet I'm stepping on somebody's political toes and whatever, but you need that committee. It's got to come from somewhere. I don't think it's going to come from the Measure U, votes or whatever, but that's the function of the chamber, one of the functions of the chamber. Not being done here. You don't have a downtown business group. Not being done here. There's just certain things missing that is kind of hard to fall on the staff to take care of, because it's not our property or anything, and we can't negotiate the lease or say we'll pay for the TIs and include it in your rent, and when the TIs are paid for, we'll reduce the rent. And so that's kind of difficult. That seems to be a segment that's missing here. And it would really help if you're talking about vacant buildings and such, and buildings that have been vacant for 20 years. So that's a big hole.
Okay. I'm going to open it up for public comment, but before I do, I want to apologize that I didn't open up the last item for public comment, so we'll come back to that for public comment after we finish up with this discussion. So with that, I'll open it up for public comment. Sarah.
Okay, your first speaker will be Marie McDonald, and she'll be followed by Mary Ann Derwin.
Mr. Mayor, City Council, and City Manager. I think some of the comments that have been said tonight really hit a sore point for me, and that is looking for additional revenue. As all of you have acknowledged, we can't keep cutting. We need more money coming in. And I don't understand why we aren't taking advantage of the era in which we live. Opening the industry of marijuana dispensaries and growing locations have solved the fiscal problems for a number of small cities just like ours. And those cities are able to give their employees raises they haven't had. If you do your homework, you'll find there's no increase in police activity, in opiate deaths, in problems if you put in very stringent laws. The communities that have done that have flourished. They've not only served their older community, people who are using a lot of marijuana to live comfortably. And I don't understand why we're not progressing in that direction, for one, because it's right there in front of us. We've got the space, we've got the acreage, we've got the buildings, we've got a perfect location for a lot of activity that would bring in money and without causing the city a lot of problems if we set up the proper laws and we have other cities to look at who can give us examples to follow. So, that's my 2 cents worth.
There is a report that we just received, the city manager just received, and he will be going public with that shortly.
So what does it say?
Well, it talks about cannabis, and so there'll be an upcoming meeting.
Does it repeat what I want to say?
When it comes out, it'll go over all that, so, yeah.
He's so cute.
Hi there.
Hi, good afternoon. So first of all, to talk about the budget is last year I was here when you guys were all discussing the budget and how you were going to handle it. I don't think any big company is going to come here if they feel that Hemet can't balance their budget. Number one, who's going to want to come and invest if you can't even show that you can balance your budget? Last year, there wasn't even this much conversation on the budget. I have to commend the city manager. He has done more work on the city budget to get us to be balanced than the last city manager did. And and everybody up there, except for 1 or 2, went ahead and said, okay, we'll just pass it and we'll look at the budget later. And so here we are again, and we're in the same problem where we are at a deficit. So I think that we do have a lot to offer people coming into Hemet. I really do. I think that, yes, the safety on the streets has come tremendous. But what we're not saying is that also with the police force and with not even any Measure U money, because it's only been a year, the Hemet gatekeepers have had something to do with that. And nobody's mentioned that they did it without any city money at all. It was completely funded by one person who saw a problem and went out there and bought all the cars and hired the people and has helped with the police and the citizens to make our streets safer. And that didn't cost the city any money at all. Nothing to them. So, that's why I don't understand why it's never mentioned. It's almost like a taboo that we just don't say their name. But I'd like to give them credit because without their help, we would still be struggling because we've just only been able to hire another 11 police officers in the last year. So that helps bring us up to speed. I do want to say, though, that last week, it upset me that we have people on the board that have been in charge of a budget for the last 6 years at least, and got upset with Alan because he hasn't done anything in 9 months. And I really think that is unfair to expect him to be able to come up and in 9 months and be able to fix all the problems when they've been there for the last 6 years. And nobody seemed to do anything then. We just kept pushing that can right down the road, and so here we are. So at least I'm glad that someone has actually looked at the budget, saw what needed to be done, and has taken an active approach on trying to fix it and helping Hemet so we can get people in and we can get businesses here. Thank you.
Thank you.
Okay, your next speaker is Pat Gregory, and she'll be followed by Rob Davis.
Good evening, Mayor, council
evening.
members. After I went to the Measure U meeting yesterday, I spent all day yesterday and all day today preparing this great speech about the budget, but I can't do it because I looked at the budget and it's great. I have to admit, this is the best thing I have seen this city do in a long time. I didn't like the city manager when he came in. I'll admit it. However, I have to change my opinion. This budget is actually balanced. It's something that hasn't been done for years. And why? It's because the city manager has done it. I've sat here tonight and I've watched some of the council members complain about this or that in the budget. But the point is, this is a budget meeting. You have to make reductions. You have to slice things. We can't put in fairy tales about what great housing developments we want in a budget. You can't do that. You have to look at the numbers. You have to subtract out what you have to subtract out to balance the budget. I think he did a great job. I don't have a lot to complain about tonight. I'm really upset about this. Now, but I have one thing. So next year, I think we need to go forward from this point. And again, I congratulate the city manager and his deputy for what they've done. They've balanced the budget. But that being said, next year, we need to take a good look at the investments. Ms. Savage has done a tremendous amount of work, and she found $400,000 without cutting one person. And I'm going to harp a little bit upon the city attorney fees. They're $1.1 million, greater than Temecula, twice as much as San Jacinto, twice as much as Paris. We have to take a look at that, and we have to find out why. Can't do it today because there's no time, but obviously these are things like the investments, the city manager, there's other areas that can be looked at to fix it for next year. But I have to applaud the city manager and take back what I said about him because he's done a great job in balancing this budget. So thank you.
Thank you.
Following Rob will be Howard Rosenthal.
Good evening, Mr. Mayor and City Council. Rob Davis. I live in the county area. My business is located in the city of Hemet. Just a couple points. Measure U never promised anybody that there would be $10 million a year raised. That would have been a lie. We couldn't do that. It was always an estimate. The city knows that better than I do because we got our numbers from the city of Hemet, from their professionals. That wasn't something we came up with. We always knew it to be an estimate. So to claim now that anything above 10 million is free game, it is just dishonest, because what if it comes in at 9 million? Is the general fund going to make up that money the next year? Everybody always knew it was an estimate, but we knew we needed a certain amount of money to get enough officers to clean up the city, to do the things that our mayor's talking about, to have a hope for new businesses coming in. When you talk about new businesses coming in, public safety is probably the highest priority there is, because no one's going to come where they're not feeling safe. If you think back to last year, first year Measure U came into existence, there was a debate that started over whether or not Measure U could be used to fund the same debate we're having now, fund raises for public safety. Had Measure U not passed, public safety had been put off for a long time in getting raises, and the city would have had to give them raises anyway. And there wouldn't have been any discussion over should we use the Measure U funds to do that, because there wouldn't have been a Measure U fund to take it from. And the city would have been having the same discussion, except for it couldn't blame Measure U. It's sort of incredible to me that getting an extra $1 million plus in the budget this year has suddenly become such a huge problem, and that Measure U could be blamed for bringing on money. The problem isn't Measure U. The problem is the city has a budget shortfall, and it's systemic. It's been here for a while. I, along with everybody else, watched the state come in and do an audit and give a lot of recommendations. I'm not sure if any of them have been taken up on yet. And so to come up year after year and say, we can't save $3.5 million or whatever the number is, I agree. How do you get that out of 20%? You don't do it in 1 year. But at some point in time, the city's going to have to right size, and it's going to have to deal with the fact that it has a budget shortfall that isn't going away. I mean, we can all hope that there's just a huge increase in the economy, but that's just a hope. It's not a plan. I am only asking the city to keep its word. And I want you to think back. Keep Hemet Safe didn't exist before the election, first for Measure E, then Measure U. It came about when people from the city came to us as business owners and said, will you run a campaign for a sales tax increase? That's how it came about. This is a bunch of business owners who didn't want a sales increase, but they convinced us it was the only way to clean up the city. And so we did what we didn't want to do. We created a committee. We went out and raised a bunch of money, and we did it. And now to have barbs thrown at us for doing that and only asking the city to do exactly what they told us it would do and exactly what the resolution was meant to do, I know you can work around it. I'm a lawyer. I work around language all the time. But the intent of that was not to fund anything else. It was just to fund Measure U. To now be put under condemnation for that is quite a thank you for going out and doing exactly what the city asked us to do. And I know a lot of you are new, and you weren't here during that time period, but I think it's incumbent upon you to do what, frankly, the city manager didn't do until just a couple days ago, reach out to us and find out what's going on. If you really didn't know what it was about, then come and talk to us. It's not like we're hiding. We've all met you. You know who we are.
Thank you very much.
Following Howard Rosenthal will be Rich Piper, and Rich will have 6 minutes.
Thank you, Howard Rosenthal. The city needs to balance the budget. Nobody believes differently. But unfortunately, none of us, and I'm chair of Keep Hemet Safe, live our lives on single agendas. My partner and I manage over 300,000 square feet of office and retail and medical. We have no vacancies that have been vacant for 20 years, 15 years, 10 years, or 8 years. But the biggest problem we had was crime and safety. Hemet's reputation for crime exceeds what it deserves, and we all know that. You go to LA, you go to ICSC, you meet with people. I've been in that industry 4 decades, and what do we hear? So we all worked our tails off, including a lot of you, most of you all supported it. Said, wait a minute, we're going to go single agenda. If it's not safe and clean, we're not going to retain business, we're not going to grow business. We can see a difference in the last year. Everybody has. But you don't go a week in Hemet without car chases, people with loaded guns every day that are on probation. Hemet didn't create the failure of the penal system in California. That system hasn't been fixed. We can't keep people in county jail. We can't get them to state prison. So, unfortunately, for good or bad, public safety's ruling the day. But that's no reason to turn other departments against public safety, however unintended. But that's the message that comes out today. Measure U caused the problem. No, Measure U was a desperate attempt to stabilize the crime. When we passed Measure U, you had 2,500 plus violent gang members in the valley. The county had scrapped their gang task force. Your fire department had been depleted and destroyed by a previous council that wanted to give the contract to CAL FIRE. Your police department had been demoralized, taken from 88 to 57. You all know, probably better than me, every police and fire department in California is out there recruiting and desperately hiring. We've had calls from rank and file firemen and policemen for a week and a half about zero raise. So, unfortunately, I think if you're going to, in the 3 to 5 year range, reestablish reputation that Hemet is a little town that did, and is now safe and safer with a great reputation, that will affect business. And Mayor, I'm sorry, all the housing expansion last time left us gutted when the commuters walked away. And it's well known that rooftops of families are a net negative cost to cities for services. So if we're serious about growing revenue, we've got to have a great reputation for being safe and clean. Then we can have a place where people want to be. I recruit doctors in this town. My partner and I in our real estate business constantly recruit businesses. Nobody has brought more businesses here and jobs than our firm has. Okay, your city manager, Alan knows, has had a standing offer from me for over 4 months to volunteer, sign non-disclosure, and work for free when you can bring employers or retailers and you need any help. You've had an offer for over 4 months to volunteer people like Todd Fouts, Kevin Fahrenkoff, and Eric Gosh to look at budget, look at suggestions. So it's not that the business community doesn't want to step up and help. And Deanna and her department and Public Works, they're great. They bend over backwards to work with us. But this isn't them against public safety. But if we want Hemet to be great again, we better not slow down in any way, because this community voted to make that their number one priority. Thank you.
Thank you.
Richard Biden. And he'll be followed by Lori Gunnarsdale.
Good afternoon, Rich Piper. I live in Hemet West. I have a few items that I'd like to chat about. First of all, I want to thank everybody that's involved in these processes for the work and the passion that they put into it. I realize it's not easy. I'm not a financier. I'm not a business owner. I was going to say, I can imagine what you're going through. I can't imagine what you're going through. It doesn't even register. I just know that our community needs to be safe. It needs to be clean in order to attract quality businesses and residents to our area. When we went out, Measure U, Howard and Kevin and Rob and Eric and Bruce and a lot of their friends were the money and the brains behind this whole thing. I was the support, so I don't take any credit for what happened. I was just supporting them. as far as what we promised, it wasn't a promise. We were trying to explain what Measure U would accomplish over a 10-year period. It was just that simple. Chief Brown and now Chief Webb had a plan. They put the plan out there. They had 5 years that they were going to increase police and fire services, equipment, and different things like that, and it was going to be continued over the next 5 years. The key was they were planning on a $10 million nut, if I'm not mistaken. That was the number that we had as an estimate. So their plans were based on $10 million a year. It seems like it's going to be a little bit more, but their plan was $10 million a year. If you start taking money out of that $10 million, then the plan kind of falls apart. It's like anything else in your home budget. If you're planning on that you want to save to buy a house, in 1 year you don't put away the money that you said you were going to put away, your plan kind of falls apart or is delayed another year or whatever it is. We can't afford that. The whole premise was that we were going to take police from the present 68 to a max or a number of 108. They were going to bring 40 policemen on board, along with all their equipment and all the things that go along with it. I think it was 16, if I'm not mistaken, Chief Brown, 16 firefighters and equipment and things like that. The whole premise to get to those numbers was $10 million a year. That's what it was going to take to get there. So if you start taking away from the 10 million, those plans fall apart. I don't know how they manage it if they don't have that 10 million. And of course, there's always that possibility they could not produce 10 million for that year. That's why they need what they have right now is the excess for this year, last year, this year, and the next year is for the future years. Because they know there's going to be the need for it. The whole plan was built on that. It wasn't pie in the sky and just pulled out of the air. These guys worked really, really hard at doing that. The key was they wanted, and we agreed, and the city fathers at that point agreed, 1.2 officers per 1,000. That was kind of the nut. That was kind of the average or what everybody aspired to around the cities and the states. 1.2 is a good police force. That's what we wanted to do. It was for, the whole premise was new police and firemen. You guys were already taking care of the existing 68. You were already at 72%, 74%. Y'all agreed in premise to hold to that. That would be taking care of the regular police. I don't see that we created a split between them and us, or how was it, their officers and our officers. I don't see that at all. The Measure U money was to bring more officers on board, so the officers that were on board weren't working 16-hour shifts, weren't working 7 days or 8 days in a row, and that's unsafe in my book. So it wasn't a promise, it was a plan. That's what the plan was. We need to protect that $10 million. I'm kind of ambivalent.